Thank you very much, Brother Bland. The Bible provides a number of principles that highlight the danger of pride and overconfidence, disloyalty, self-reliance, greed. But Jehovah also included the example of people to help us to see how those principles can be applied. Now, this week, we're going to focus on Numbers 15 and 16. Those two chapters are going to give us a number of warning examples that we can focus on. And then throughout our meeting, we'll also focus on other warning examples by looking at people from the Bible. Not only will the danger of the bad qualities be highlighted, but we're also going to consider qualities that will help us to do things that please Jehovah. So we look forward to an excellent meeting. Let's get started right away with Brother David Baker. He'll handle our treasures from God's Word. The theme, beware of pride and overconfidence.
Pride and overconfidence are often self-destructive. There's a saying that pride eats up a person, leaving very little to admire. Frequently, pride reflects itself in an unseemly self-esteem, a feeling of superiority because of one's abilities, their appearance, their wealth, their rank. How does pride manifest itself? Through disdainful behavior, a boasting, an insolence, or arrogance. But what is confidence? Confidence is an inner knowledge that you're capable of doing something without any suggestion of conceit or arrogance. But overconfidence means that one is excessively or unjustifiably confident. Pride and overconfidence can easily creep up on you and corrode your personality. Hence the warning, beware of pride and overconfidence. Does a Bible character come to mind of one who displayed excessive pride and overconfidence? Maybe you're thinking of Korah, who was portrayed in the video, Respect Jehovah's Authority. What lessons can we learn from this individual and from those who sided with him? Let's go back in time. We're with the nation of Israel. We're en route to the promised land. And there's a man named Korah in the tribe. He perceives what he imagines to be problems with those who are taking the lead in God's arrangement. So seeing their imperfections, Korah might have reasoned, these priests are unacceptably imperfect, and I'm expected to be in subjection to them? Aaron made a golden calf that caused the people to fall into idolatry. And now Aaron, Moses' brother, is serving as high priest. What favoritism! And what of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu? Why, they showed such gross disrespect for their privileges of service that Jehovah had to put them to death. Whatever Korah was reasoning, it is clear that he began to view the priesthood from a human standpoint. This led him to rebel against Jehovah's arrangement because he became proud and overconfident. Please turn in your Bibles to Numbers chapter 16. So let's set the stage. And if you can, imagine that you are there listening to Korah. So Numbers chapter 16, we're going to start in verse 1. So note what takes place. Numbers 16 and verse 1. Then Korah, the son of Ishar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, got up together with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, of the sons of Reuben. They rose up against Moses along with 250 Israelite men, chieftains of the assembly, chosen ones of the congregation, prominent men. So they gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "We have had enough of you. The whole assembly is holy, all of them, and Jehovah is in their midst. Why then should you exalt yourselves above the congregation of Jehovah?" As you're listening to this, you think, how shocking. Yet not only Korah, but 250 chieftains in the nation side with him. These are your fellow Israelites. Some may be your relatives. Why would they make such rebellious accusations? Korah and the chieftains must have felt secure about the relationship with Jehovah. So note what they said in verse 3 to Moses. we have had enough of you. The whole assembly is holy, all of them, and Jehovah is in their midst. Yes, what an overconfident and prideful attitude. And if that's not enough, know what they continue to say in verse 3. Why then should you exalt yourselves above the congregation of Jehovah? Who was this Korah? Korah was a respected Levite who enjoyed many privileges. But note what Moses warns him as we continue in verse 8. Moses then said to Korah, listen, please, you sons of Levi. Does it seem to you such a little thing that the God of Israel has separated you from the assembly of Israel and allowed you to approach him in order to perform the service of Jehovah's tabernacle and to stand before the assembly to minister to them? And that he brought you near to him, along with all your brothers, the sons of Levi? Must you also try to secure the priesthood? Well, that gives us a little idea of his background. Korah was a Kohathite Levite. He was a first cousin of Moses and Aaron, and he worked closely with them. He was privileged to be among those who were miraculously delivered through the Red Sea. He likely shared in the executing of Jehovah's judgment against the calf-worshiping Israelites in Mount Sinai, and he even helped to transport the Ark of the Covenant. So apparently, he was loyal to Jehovah for some years and looked up to by many in the camp of Israel. But Moses and Korah stand in sharp contrast regarding their respect of Jehovah's arrangement and his decisions. Their reactions had a bearing on how Jehovah viewed them. Remember, Moses was referred to as by far the meekest of all the men on the face of the earth. So could it be that Korah envied Moses and he envied Aaron, that he resented their prominence? Whatever his thought process, he failed to recognize that the greatest honor in serving Jehovah faithfully, according to his arrangement, is not by some special status or position. So what does Moses do? He invites Korah and his men to gather the following morning at the tent of meeting with fire holders and incense. Why fire holders and incense? Moses wanted to test their heart condition. He wanted to test their loyalty to Jehovah's priestly arrangement. How so? Korah and his men were not priests, so they were not authorized to have these fire holders and to offer incense. So if they came with these instruments, they would still be showing pride and overconfidence. They would still have or feel that they had the right to act as priests. So what happens the next morning? Well, as you arrive and you see, here they come with fire holders, and now they're offering incense. Yes, they are still acting as if they are priests. How does Jehovah feel about their pride and overconfidence? Korah's wrong thinking had dire circumstances. Notice what happens next in verse 32. And the earth opened and swallowed them up, along with their households and everything that belonged to Korah and all their goods. And if that wasn't enough, verse 35, then a fire came out from Jehovah and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. How sad. Korah and all those who sided with him died in this rebellion. So what do we learn from the warning example of Korah and his sympathizers? We must not allow our achievements in Jehovah's service to cause us to develop pride and overconfidence like they did. When a brother is in a position of responsibility, it's true that his faults can become more apparent. But dwelling on his faults, though, can breed disloyalty through pride and overconfidence. The Respect Jehovah's Authority video brought this life-warning example of Korah. Yes, though he probably was loyal for many years, he became ambitious. He came to resent the authority of Moses and Aaron, his first cousins. And though Moses was the meekest of men, Korah began to look at him through critical eyes. Through his pride and overconfidence, Korah saw glaring faults in Moses. These faults, however, did not justify disloyalty to Jehovah's organization. He and his arrogant renegades attempted to usurp the priesthood. So Jehovah had no choice. Jehovah had to destroy them from the midst of the congregation. The longer we are in the truth, or the weightier our responsibilities, the more humble we need to be. Remember the scripture injunctions? Pride is before a crash, and the one who thinks he is standing, beware that he does not fall. So remember the warning example of Korah and his rebellious sympathizers. Yes, may we beware of pride and overconfidence.
Thank you very much, Brother Baker, for highlighting those practical examples, the danger of pride and overconfidence, and also how humility can serve us well in contrast to that. Well, likely with a little bit of digging, you found many other gems in Numbers chapters 15 and 16. So let's follow along with Joshua Marsh as we consider these gems.
Our first spiritual gem that's been selected for us to consider is taken from Numbers chapter 15 and verses 32 through 35. Could we have a volunteer to read those verses for us, please? Sister Bland, please.
While the Israelites were in the wilderness, they found a man collecting pieces of wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him collecting wood brought him up to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly. They committed him into custody because it had not been specified what should be done to him. And Jehovah said to Moses, "The man should be put to death without fail, and the whole assembly should stone him outside the camp."
Thank you for that excellent reading. So the question on these verses is, what lesson does this account teach? Turn our attention to Sister Watts, please.
This account teaches us a lesson in properly setting our priorities today. For example, we wouldn't want to take on a job or work that would prevent us from our spiritual routine.
Thank you. Powerful lesson. And we'll turn to the Johnstons, please.
Yes, and at Philippians 1:10, we see this borne out where it says to make sure the more important things first. And the reason why is that so that we can be flawless and not stumble others. So in order to have a good relationship with Jehovah and with our brothers, we want to make spiritual things our priority.
Excellent. And Sister Carly, please.
And I was thinking how currently in the age of Zoom meetings and Zoom ministry, this can bring new challenges, that we might set aside the time for meetings and ministry as we know we should, but mentally it can be challenging to be focused while we're part of a Zoom meeting or Zoom preaching because we're in our homes. We might see our kitchen and wonder what's for dinner, do I have everything I need? But how important it is to keep our priorities mentally by staying focused while we're at meetings and in the ministry.
Appreciate that application. The last one on this point, we'll call on Brother and Sister Baker.
Although we are no longer under this law, Luke 16:10 brings out that the person faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and the person unrighteous in what is least is unrighteous also in much. So this bears a point as to setting our priorities.
Thank you. So now, what spiritual gems from this week's Bible reading would you like to share regarding Jehovah, the field ministry, or something else? We'll call on Brother Bland, please.
Well, Numbers 15:32 through 35 shows that no one during the 1,000-year Sabbath year of Jesus' reign will be permitted to disturb the peace and rest of that day. And this was foreshadowed by putting to death all those Sabbath breakers.
Thank you. And Brother Baker, please.
In Numbers 15:37 through 39, it discusses the fringes on the garments. So you can just imagine living in the time of Israel, there were garments that looked different than what you had. You may feel you stood at, that you were out of place. But Jehovah said, no, you need these because you need to show you're separate from the unbelievers around you. So today, it's easy to start looking like the world. And once we start dressing like the world, then we start acting like the world. So the fringe garments then and now are a strong reminder to keep separate from the world.
Thank you. And Sister Lome?
In Numbers chapter 15, the early part, we read about the commandment Jehovah's giving for how the Israelites are to give their offerings and sacrifices. In verse 3, it mentions about making a pleasing aroma to Jehovah. And we do know that for us today, this aroma is like prayers going to Jehovah. But during the time of the Israelites, this pleasing aroma, the footnote, says for pleasing that it gives Jehovah rest. So we can imagine for Jehovah during this time, especially with what was happening with Korah, seeing his faithful Israelites do these sacrifices and offerings, what rest it gave Jehovah. And it's similar for us today with our prayers, that we can give Jehovah, we have the privilege of giving our Almighty Father rest from the sufferings he sees within the world.
Thank you. And Sister Poland, please.
The world we live in today is so divided by race and language and social issues, but Jehovah sets a beautiful example in Numbers 15:14-16, where he said the foreign residents should be the same as you. There should be one law, one judicial decision. And so we belong to a wonderful worldwide brotherhood that is so global and international that we want to make everyone feel welcome. We want to be impartial and love all our brothers as Jehovah does.
Thank you. And Brother Johnston, please.
Chapter 15, going back to Korah and the rebellion there, the 250 were chieftains. Just a very short time earlier in chapter 7 records 12 chieftains presented gifts for the inauguration of the tabernacle. Were some of those 12 a part of this 250 person rebellion? We don't know, but it illustrates the point that in times of change, times of organizational adjustment, we all must obey the direction and follow the lead of Jehovah's organization in complying with such adjustments.
Thank you. And Sister Marsh?
Numbers 15:39, it says, you must not follow your own hearts and eyes, which are leading you to spiritual prostitution. So Jehovah, as our creator, he knows exactly how we're made, and he knows how easily our hearts can be deceived by what we see and what appeals to our eyes. So it's just a good reminder that we need to cultivate self-control to make sure that what we're looking at is not something that could affect our hearts or weaken our spirituality.
Thank you. And we'll call on Brother Gregor, please.
I found number 16, verse 41 interesting, because the Israelites had just seen the ground open up and consume those that were murmuring against Moses and Aaron. And it was immediately after this event that they continued to murmur. And it was because they didn't loyally attach themselves to Jehovah and trust his channel of direction. So at this point, he was using Moses, but today he uses the faithful and discreet slave. So it's up to us. We can regularly ask ourselves if by our words and our actions, if we prove that we can prove that we trust how Jehovah is leading us by those he's appointed to take the lead.
Thank you. And we'll call on Brother Poland, please.
Numbers 16, 16 and 17, it reveals the depth of Jehovah's loving concern for humans, even those on a pathway towards rebelling against him. Instead of dealing with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and the other rebels as the situation arose, Moses invited Korah and his men to rather gather the next morning to offer incense. This gave them the whole night to reconsider their course. They could reason on the clear fact that they weren't priests, so they shouldn't really be offering incense. They could have meditated on the unselfish, loyal leadership of Moses and Aaron. And really, this should have been a wake-up call for them. And for On, the son of Peleth, it may well have been. He's listed as one of the original instigators, but his name is not mentioned when they were destroyed. And one possible explanation is that he withdrew from the rebellion after Moses initially rebuked the rebels. So while Jehovah's patience does have limits, he lovingly provides every opportunity for people to correct their course before it is too late.
Thank you. And Brother Worlds, please.
And I appreciate it coming off of the heels of Jehovah's disappointment in chapter 14. Immediately, as previously commented in the beginning of chapter 15, Jehovah gives direction as to, it says in verse 2, that when you eventually come into the land that I'm giving you to dwell in, and then he gives them direction in connection with their offerings. And so it shows that Jehovah was looking forward, that he wasn't brooding or harboring resentment, and that he was already making provisions for them to be pleasing to him in the future. And so not only can we imitate that in our dealings with others, but it shows that in the event that we've made mistakes, and if you've dealt with them, that you too can look forward the way that Jehovah is looking forward, because he's already making provisions for us to be pleasing to him in the future.
Thank you. And for our last comment, we'll call on Brother Carly.
In Numbers 16, verse 36, Moses commanded that the fire holders for the 250 be the copper be beat into thin metal sheets and put around the altar. And it says in verse 40, it was a reminder for the Israelites. Jehovah knows that we are physical creatures, and oftentimes out of sight is out of mind. And Jehovah knows this about our makeup, so he would use things for imperfect people to remind them. Chapter 15, like Brother Baker brought out, the blue thread, the altar being overlaid with these copper metals. Today, we don't necessarily have the same directives or physical reminders, but Jehovah does have a lot of physical things that he's created for us, such as creation itself. So by meditating on what Jehovah has put in front of us and seeing that and reflecting his power, wisdom, love, and justice, it could be reminders to us to uphold our Christian identity and to bring Jehovah honor, not ourselves or others.
Thank you, Brother Carly, and thank you all for your well thought out comments.
Well, as we would expect, in just 2 chapters of the Bible, so many spiritual gems and things that we can glean. Thank you very much for that, Brother Marsh. That was excellent. Now let's read a portion of this week's Bible reading together. Let's follow along with Brother Gregor. He's going to read from Numbers 15, verses 1 through 16, to highlight some laws that Jehovah issued regarding offerings.
Jehovah spoke further to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you eventually come into the land that I am giving you to dwell in, and you make an offering by fire to Jehovah from the herd or from the flock, whether a burnt offering or a sacrifice to perform a special vow or a voluntary offering, or an offering during your seasonal festivals, in order to make a pleasing aroma to Jehovah, the one presenting his offering must also present to Jehovah a grain offering of fine flour, 1/10 of an ephah, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil. You should also offer wine as a drink offering, 1/4 of a hin, together with the burnt offering or for the sacrifice of each male lamb. Or for a ram, you should make a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah measure of fine flour mixed with 1/3 of a hin of oil. And you should present wine as a drink offering, 1/3 of a hin, as a pleasing aroma to Jehovah. But if you should offer a male of the herd as a burnt offering, or a sacrifice to perform a special vow, or communion sacrifices to Jehovah, you should also present together with the male of the herd a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah measure of fine flour mixed with 1/2 a hin of oil. You should also present wine as a drink offering, 1/2 a hin, as an offering made by fire, as a pleasing aroma to Jehovah. This is what should be done for each bull, or for each ram, or for each of the male lambs or of the goats. Whatever may be the number that you offer, that is what you should do for each one, according to their number. This is how every native-born Israelite should present an offering made by fire, as a pleasing aroma to Jehovah. If a foreigner who is residing with you, or one who has been in your midst for many of your generations, should also make an offering by fire, as a pleasing aroma to Jehovah, he should do just as you do. You who are of the congregation and the foreigner who is residing with you will have one statute. It will be a lasting statute for all your generations. The foreign resident should be the same as you before Jehovah. There should be one law and one judicial decision for you and for the foreigner who is residing with you.
Thank you very much, Brother Gregor. When you think of rules or laws being given, it better be clear. And as you read through these laws that Jehovah gave regarding the offerings, It was very clear. And so anyone listening would have been able to follow the rules or the laws that were given. When you think about modulation, the way we vary our volume and our pitch and our pace, in some cases, we might think of emphasizing things all the time, but it can also be what we don't emphasize. And what I noticed that really stood out in verses 4, 6, and 9, where you mentioned the fine flour, you didn't emphasize, and it must be fine flour, because there are no offerings where you wouldn't present fine flour. So they're all fine flour, and there was no need to emphasize that. So that was excellent. And then also in verse 14, you changed the topic a little bit to focus on the foreigners, but it was just a little change in the pace of how you were reading. And then in verse 16, it was a nice pause when you talked about the one judicial decision for you and the foreigner. So excellent pause just to highlight little changes. So thank you for that. Excellent reading, and we all benefited from it. Now let's continue on and see some examples that we can use for our ministry. We'll start first with a video that we can discuss. So let's watch a little bit of the video first, and we'll discuss it as the video proceeds.
Today I've been discussing with people the identity of Jesus Christ. What are your thoughts about Jesus?
Okay, let's take this first question here. Now, this is a formal introduction, door to door, it looks like, but that's not an option for us right now. So how could you initiate a conversation about Jesus in an informal setting? Brother Marsh, please.
Well, considering that it's around Easter time, we could reference some local activities that are going on, or possibly merchandise we see in a store that's supposedly in remembrance of Jesus' resurrection, and then ask them, have they thought about what Jesus did during his life that could affect us on earth today?
Nice, very practical. Brother Worlds, please.
Because everyone has a lot of free time on their hands now since the pandemic, we can ask, what are some of the things that we've done with our free time? Ask the household or whoever the person that we're speaking to. We can ask them that, but then we can also say that we've been focusing on spiritual things. And one of the things that we've been studying is about Jesus, and then ask them their thoughts about Jesus.
Excellent. Nice way to start the conversation. Let's continue on. Let's look at our example from the video.
I think he was a good man.
He certainly was. In fact, he was the greatest man who ever lived. But the Bible identifies him as being much more than that. Consider what we read here at Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. Jesus has just asked his disciples who they believe he is. Notice their response. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So, according to this verse, who was Jesus? Was Jesus just a good man or more?
More. It says he was the Son of God.
That's right. Of course, we might wonder, since Jesus is the Son of God, and a perfect Son at that, why did he die? Maybe we can discuss the Bible's answer the next time we talk.
Yes, I'd like that.
Okay, so he had some interest here. If the householder does show interest, or the person that we're talking to informally shows interest, what publication from our teaching toolbox would you offer? Brother Bland, please.
Well, we could use the book, What Can the Bible Teach Us? And we could refer to chapter 4, which has the title, Who is Jesus Christ? Or we could refer to chapter 5 about the ransom, God's greatest gift. So Jesus wasn't just a good man, but the ransom.
Good point, yes. Sister Pullum, please.
And perhaps if we're writing a letter, we could include the tract, How Do You View the Future? Because that in that tract it says that Jesus wants to help us to enjoy a happy future.
Nice point, thank you. Sister Watts, please.
And also, if we're writing a letter, we could ask them if they thought about what Jesus taught, and we could give them the kingdom tract that highlights that Jesus taught about the kingdom.
Good point. Nice way to introduce that tract. So there are a number of tools that we have. One, different ways to initiate conversations in these unique times that we have. But then also, once we have that interest being shown, things that we can use from our teaching toolbox to really provide information that will help the person that we're talking to. Thank you very much for the feedback and the suggestions for that. Now let's look in on a demonstration to see how this can be done locally, especially with the unique times that we have with phone witnessing. We're going to look in on an initial call with Sister Laura Johnston. She'll be our publisher. Her householder will be Sister Paris Lomé.
Hello, it's nice to find you at home. My name is Laura, one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and we're calling since we can't visit in person. How are you and your family coping with the effects of the pandemic?
Oh, that's so nice of you. My family are doing okay, each taking it day at a time, but thank you for asking.
Sure, it's been a difficult time for all of us. Well, you know, at this time of year, we find that many people are thinking about Jesus. And yet there are many opinions about who Jesus was. I'd like to ask you, who do you think Jesus was? A good man, God himself, or the Son of God?
To say, I really am not sure.
You know, that was something many were unsure about even in Jesus' day. In fact, Jesus asked his own disciples who they thought he was. The Bible contains their clear and simple answer that Jesus confirmed. At Matthew 16:16, it says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So according to the Bible, who is Jesus?
It said he is the Son of God.
Yes, not just a good man, not God himself, but the Son of God. This makes it very clear, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
But it also raises some other questions. If Jesus is the Son of God, why did he have to die? And how does Jesus being the Son of God benefit you and me?
I would actually like to learn more about that.
Great. Well, perhaps I can call you back at this time on Wednesday and answer those questions for you.
I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. And may I ask your name?
It's Paris.
Paris, nice to meet you. Mine's Laura. It was such a pleasure speaking with you. But before I go, Paris, I'd like to reference our website, jw.org. There you will find an abundance of Bible-based information. For example, more information about Jesus, and also information that's helping many cope with our difficult, that's helping many cope with our difficult times.
Oh, okay. So that was jw.org?
That's correct.
Oh, I'll check that out. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'll look forward to our conversation on Wednesday. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Sister Johnson, thank you very much for that example. The great thing about that example is when we walk away from it, we have in our mind, I can do something like that. You made it very practical, very easy to understand. Your introduction was effective. There was no wrong answer that you were going to have to make your householder feel embarrassed. In fact, she said she didn't even know the answer. And right away, when she said that, you said, well, many were unsure, even in Jesus' day. So you made really the playing field very even for your householder to keep her comfortable, which was excellent. You kept the subject very clear. You stuck to Jesus and how we could benefit from his life and example. And even the householder, she said, yes, that's very clear after looking into the scripture. So that's excellent. And it was practical for her. How does it benefit you and me? That was going to be the subject of the next call. And so it gave her something to look forward to. And then also with jw.org, you highlighted the difficult times that we're living in and how that website can help. So a number of things. If we take just note of one or two, as soon as this week, we can put those into practice. Thank you very much for those nice examples. Now let's focus on a talk for a few minutes. One subject, Brother Mason Carley is going to help us with this. So Brother Carley, we look forward to your theme. What is the difference between proper and improper pride?
He's a proud man. You likely bristle hearing this said about you. What about, I'm so proud of him? Better? Pride is often colored with a negative definition. Pride is when a pride in one's culture, race, belief structure, way of life. Pride has even been confused with self-worth and acceptance to an extreme degree. We're not expected to be ashamed of our family, our culture, where we're from, where we grew up, and we're not expected to belittle ourselves and others when doing good. So is pride always improper? Is it always bad? Well, imperfection takes away what proper pride is and changes it to the ugly pride that we often see. An inordinate, inflated feeling of self-worth of one's accomplishments or identity. Most people are proud when they really have no reason to be proud. Their environment teaches them to be, inflating their own self-view, teaching them to believe that they are better than others. Satan has engineered it this way. This is not new. Satan has been leaching this poison into the hearts of men since the first rebellion. However, through his word, Jehovah is teaching us what can happen when unchecked, what improper pride could lead to. Notice the wording at Ezekiel 33 and verse 28. Turn there with me. Ezekiel 33 and verse 28. And here Jehovah is speaking, and notice how he phrases it. I will make the land an utterly desolate wasteland, and its arrogant pride will be brought to an end. Here, Jehovah instructed his appointed watchmen, says it was arrogant pride that would bring judgment. Persons also in the Bible that we find, such as Nimrod, Absalom, Cain, and like tonight we've discussed Korah, all suffered disastrous outcomes because of being infected by improper pride. Paul uses the expression puffed up with pride 7 different times in his writings. In our imperfect state, improper pride is not only dangerous to our personal relationships, but also it's a threat to our friendship with Jehovah. Clearly, it is the type of pride that is not only what we need to be aware of, but when it's appropriate to show pride. Pride can be likened to a knife. It can be a powerful tool for a cook whenever they're preparing a delicious meal, but the cook must take care to use the knife properly. It's sharp and potentially dangerous, so if wielded carelessly, he could injure others around him or even injure himself, possibly even causing lasting harm. Also, the focus of the meal is never the knife. No one sits down at a meal and says, I wonder what kind of knife they used to prepare this meal, or they sure did use a sharp knife in cooking this meal. The knife is just a minor player in the overall process. It's a tool. It's enabling them to reach a goal. Like the knife, proper pride can motivate us. It's a tool to help us to keep moving, and in proper use, it can be helpful, useful. But improper, it can be dangerous and even deadly. Jehovah created us with the emotions that comprise proper pride. Emotions such as joy, satisfaction, love, enamorment. A variety of emotions come up when we feel pride for maybe our friends or for something that we see and appreciate. We rejoice and feel satisfied when someone we love does good, such as standing up for their beliefs at school, maybe joining the pioneer ranks, or giving their first public talk. We're even encouraged to have pride in our Christian identity. For example, notice what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 4. That's 2 Thessalonians 1:4, and here's an example of proper pride. As a result, we ourselves take pride in you among the congregations of God. Why? Because your endurance and faith in all your persecutions and the hardships that you are suffering. Yes, the pride was because it was for Jehovah. Proper pride is directed in the proper way. Even Jehovah has pride, and he proves this, that pride is not in itself bad. Jehovah is proud of his loyal servants. He even expressed pride in Jesus by saying, "This is my son, the beloved, whom I have approved," or as other translations say, who I'm satisfied with or cherish. Pride, like the knife, can be used properly with care for its intended purpose. Pride should rarely be about me, occasionally about others, but always about Jehovah. The scriptures clearly state, the one who boasts, let him boast in Jehovah.
Thank you very much, Brother Carly. Excellent teaching, and especially the way that you made the point with improper and proper pride, come alive with your illustration about the knife. It really applied. It was easy to understand. It taught the main point, but just like you said with pride, the knife wasn't the whole point of the talk. You gave us a little background, but that knife was a minor player to show how proper pride can be used. And really, then you focused on a scripture almost immediately, 2 Corinthians 1:4, to highlight the importance of the right kind of pride with our Christian identity. And so we could really pull away that nice teaching point. Touched on the knife just briefly right at the end as a reminder for us, which was excellent. So that's how you use an illustration. It highlights something much more important, and we benefited from that. We'll try to put that into use with our teaching as well. Well, let's continue with the theme that we introduced earlier in the meeting. We said that we would focus on a number of warning examples from the Bible, but our songs would focus on qualities that we do well to cultivate. And our next song does just that. So let's sing song number 124 together, Ever Loyal, and then we'll move into the Living as Christians portion of our meeting. Song number 124. Thus far, we've already seen how Korah was a warning example for us, pride and overconfidence. Now let's consider some additional warning examples that we can glean from the Bible regarding disloyalty, self-reliance, and greed. Our next part, the theme is do not imitate those who are disloyal. Let's give our attention to Brother James Briggs.
Could I ever become disloyal? Well, certainly we would not want that to happen to us. But could it happen in time as a result of poor choices we have made or bad associations that we've allowed? In our Treasures from God's Word part, we learned about Korah and Dathan and Abiram who were on a course of rebellion and disloyalty as a result of pride and overconfidence. The Israelites were told to take action to avoid the punishment that was coming to those men. They were told to move away from the tents of these wicked ones. Do not touch anything that belongs to them, so that you may not be swept aside away in all their sin. The Israelites that obeyed that were spared disaster when the earth split apart underneath them and swallowed them up, as recorded in verses 31 to 33 of Numbers 16. We need to take action today to avoid being disloyal to Jehovah. We need to move away from any situation that could cause us to become disloyal. What situations could come up, though, to test our loyalty to Jehovah? And how can we move away from them? Let's see some examples in the following video. Do not imitate disloyal ones. Okay, that was a very thought-provoking video for us there. So let's review what we learned from it by asking a few questions. First of all, what situation tested Nadia, and what warning example helped her to demonstrate loyalty? Brother or Sister Johnston, please.
Well, for Nadia, her friend was pressuring her to come to a very questionable party. It would involve her sneaking out, not telling her parents, but she seasoned it well by saying, have a little fun. So she was making it very tempting for our sister.
Okay, very good. So, Sister Watts, please.
And so she recalled the warning example of Adam, who didn't think it through and was disobedient, took of the fruit when offered by Eve, and he didn't even try to readjust Eve's thinking. And so that caused Nadia to think twice about going to that party and to also talk to her friend Phoebe.
Okay, very good. So, good example there for us to think about something ahead of time. So let's go on to another, the next situation here. What situation tested a disappointed brother, and what warning example helped him to demonstrate loyalty? Brother Bland, please.
Well, this brother, Carl had been given some counsel and so this brother was disappointed because he didn't feel that Carl was treated fairly. And so he got upset, and he was going to try to fix it. He was going to sort it out together, but this could have caused great problems in the congregation.
Yeah. Good. Brother Marsh, please.
Thankfully, he remembered the account about Absalom, who in his foolish pride, he turned people away from King David, saying that he was more just or more understanding. And he was able to put himself in that scenario, recognize that he didn't know all the facts, play out the consequences in his mind, and see how the peace of the congregation could be disrupted if he took sides against the elders. So he was able to see that he couldn't let pride get in the way of his loyalty to Jehovah, and we too need to learn to stay content.
Good thoughts. And Brother Watts, please.
I thought it was interesting that they didn't go into great detail regarding what the issue was. And just like with Absalom, it didn't really matter. It was the attitude that needed to be adjusted. And so in the end, by using Absalom as the example, he was able to benefit and see it was his attitude that needed the adjustment.
Very good. Good example for us to examine our own situation here. Let's go to the next question then. What situation, let's see, tested Terence, and what warning example helped him to demonstrate loyalty? Brother Johnston, please.
Terence was tempted by his own desire to be of assistance to someone. However, the challenge came with who that someone was. She was a recently baptized individual who had some marital issues, and he was trying to handle the issue alone rather than with assistance of another elder.
Yes, exactly. Could come up with any of us elders. Sister Carly, please.
And he meditated on the example of Solomon, because Solomon was a wise man, made many good decisions throughout his life, but eventually put too much confidence in his own decision making, and that's when he fell astray from worshiping Jehovah. So by thinking about that example, the elder was able to make a good decision.
Very good. Definite example we don't want to follow. Brother Bland again, please.
And so when Caitlin called again, he made arrangements with another elder, Mike, to set up a conference call with Caitlin, and also to plan a shepherding visit with her.
Good. You corrected that situation nicely. Let's go on to our last situation then. What situation tested a brother in school, and what warning example helped him to demonstrate loyalty? Sister Baker, please.
Here we had this brother who was tempted by material possessions, and the classmate made it sound like it was easy, it was instant, he'd have money, no one would know. All these things were tempting, but then our brother thought of Judas, and what consumed him was greed. And then he then made the wise decision to talk to his parents. And so this way he avoided the trap of greediness.
Thank you. Brother Pullen, please.
And in all these scenarios, these people played through in their mind what the consequences would be of a potential course of action. And in his case, there was the example of him at the meeting, but completely distracted by this online gambling. And at that time in the background, they were actually reading the scripture from 1 Timothy 6, 9 through 11, which said that we should flee from the love of money. So by being distracted, he wasn't even getting Jehovah's counsel. So how good it was for him to meditate on the consequences and then take action.
Okay, very good. Thank you for all your comments. They all set a good example there as they thought through the issue, as Brother Pullen said, looked at the consequences that would be the result of their decisions. So it's a good way for all of us to think, and there's certainly plenty of good, well, I should say bad examples in the Bible, warning examples that we can use to our benefit in this to help us to avoid being like or following the disloyal ones.
Thank you very much. Brother Briggs for highlighting why we need to take action if we see these qualities in ourselves, but also how we can do it. And it really highlights the value of these videos, doesn't it? I don't know if any of us, other than Brother Pullen, looked to the background for that Kingdom Hall scene to see what was going on and how it would have affected our young publishers. So thank you for highlighting that, Brother Pullen. Really helps us to see we should pay as close attention as possible to all these videos. There's gems all throughout. Well, it's time for our congregation Bible study. Now, over the past few weeks, we focused on warning examples that Ezekiel gave to the ancient nation of Israel that would affect them directly. Now we're going to move into chapter 7 of our Pure Worship book. The nations will have to know that I am Jehovah. So who are the nations and what can we learn from them? Let's give our attention to Brother Paul Johnston. He's going to lead our discussion this week.
As Brother Watts mentioned, last week we finished chapter 6 with Ezekiel's ominous denunciations on Jerusalem and its impending destruction. So this evening we start chapter 7. Now, chapter 7 concludes section number 2 of our Pure Worship book. And if you recall, the title of section 2 is, "It was my sanctuary that you defiled, pure worship corrupted." So in chapter 7, which we begin this evening, this chapter will teach us what role Israel's neighbors played in that corruption of Jehovah's pure worship. Well, let's get the focus of our chapter by watching the video that provides our chapter overview. Be able to answer those questions that were presented in the video, we need to pull up a little bit and get a historic overview of these nations and what interaction they had with the nation of Israel. So that's what we'll be looking at this evening. So to begin our discussion, we look forward to your comments. Let's invite Brother Worlds to read paragraphs 1 and 2.
For hundreds of years, Israel had been like a lone sheep amid a pack of wolves. The Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites menaced Israel on its eastern border. The Philistines, constant enemies of Israel, maintained a foothold to the west. To the north lay the city of Tyre, the rich and powerful hub of a vast trading empire. To the south sprawled the ancient nation of Egypt, ruled by its god, King Pharaoh. When the Israelites relied on Jehovah, he protected them from their enemies. Time and again, though, his people and their kings allowed themselves to be corrupted by the nations that surrounded them. King Ahab is just one example of such a weak-willed ruler. A contemporary of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, he ruled the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel. He married a daughter of the Sidonian king who controlled the prosperous city of Tyre. That woman, named Jezebel, fanatically promoted Baal worship in Israel and influenced her husband to contaminate pure worship on an unprecedented scale.
So the A question on paragraphs 1 and 2, how had Israel been like a lone sheep amid wolves? And we have the illustration there that you may draw upon if you wish. Sister Bland, please.
Yes, we see there a small sheep, and that was Israel, but surrounded by wolves. And it was the nations that surrounded the nation of Israel that were enemies, the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, and the Philistines. They were like wolves, and Israel was alone.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Brother Pullen, please.
Paragraph 2 makes the point when the Israelites relied on Jehovah, he protected them from their enemies. And the picture beautifully illustrates that the sheep there in the moonlight, it knows the wolves are around, but it's not looking around nervously. It's content grazing away because it knows it has basically protection. And so when they were faithful, they had that same secure feeling.
Thank you. And Brother Briggs.
It's interesting to note, too, that 3 of those nations, Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites, were considered relative nations, relatives of Israel. But yet they were still worshiping false gods and exerting a bad influence. Israel was not allowed to destroy them, but Jehovah knew and he allowed them to exist.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. The B question, what did the Israelites and their kings allow to happen? Brother Bland.
Well, we see that in the course of time, they allowed these pagan nations to corrupt them. There was a very bad example of King Ahab, who ruled the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel. He married Queen Jezebel, who was the daughter of a Sidonian king. And Jezebel promoted Baal worship, and she influenced King Ahab to really contaminate Jehovah's worship on a scale that never existed before in Israelite history.
Thank you for that observation. Sister Watts.
Yes, and the verse at 1 Kings 16, verse 33 mentions that what Ahab did, he did more to offend Jehovah, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel prior to him. So this is the warning example of what happens when ones aren't strongly serving Jehovah and are influenced by those around them.
So true. Thank you. And Sister Marsh.
In that scripture at 1 Kings 18, verse 4, it says Jezebel was doing away with Jehovah's prophets. So it just shows how bad she was. She wasn't content with practicing Baal worship herself or just influencing her husband, the king, but she wanted to do away with pure worship by having these true prophets killed.
Thank you. And Brother Gregert.
And this idea of disloyalty to Jehovah wasn't new for them. Over the course of time, the Israelite nation had several past examples to learn from, specifically even from this week's Bible reading that we went through. But they didn't take lessons and take these lessons to heart or choose to grow from it. And them not learning from the past ultimately becomes their downfall once again.
Thank you. Brother Baker.
And often when the king allowed these influences to enter into himself, then it affected the whole nation. And Ahab was referred to here as a weak-willed king, or we could just say henpecked king, because he allowed his wife, who was a pagan to begin with, to influence him, then that influenced the whole nation.
Nice point. So going back to the illustration, it begs the question, was that sheep always the innocent victim? In these cases, because Ahab was worse in the eyes of Jehovah than all those who were prior to him, according to verse 30 of the chapter, oftentimes they brought Jehovah's disfavor upon them. Let's move on to paragraphs 3 and 4. Brother Worlds.
Jehovah had warned his people about the consequences of disloyalty to him. Now his patience had finally run out. In 609 BCE, the Babylonian army returned to the Promised Land for the third time. It had been almost 10 years since their last invasion. This time, they would tear down the walls of Jerusalem and crush those who rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. As the siege began and Ezekiel's inspired prophecies were fulfilled in grim detail, the prophet turned his attention to the nations surrounding the Promised Land. Jehovah revealed to Ezekiel that Judah's enemies would rejoice over the destruction of Jerusalem and harass the survivors. But the nations that slandered Jehovah's name and persecuted or corrupted his people would not escape the consequences of their actions. What practical lessons can we learn from Israel's interaction with those nations? And how do Ezekiel's prophecies regarding the nations give us hope today?
Thank you for reading, Brother Worlds. To whom did Ezekiel now turn his attention? The Carlys, please. Sister Carly.
These chapters 25 through 32 of Ezekiel are now prophecies against those surrounding nations, those enemy nations. And Teaching Box 1B helped me visualize this. The overview of the book of Ezekiel, chapters 4 through 24, have been all about prophecies against Jerusalem and the badness in Jerusalem, but beginning now with chapters 25 through 32, the focus shifts to these enemy nations before he begins giving prophecies about the restoration.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Sister Baker, please.
And Jehovah was going to turn his attention to these nations because they gloated over the destruction of Jerusalem. And so they were not going to escape the consequences of this.
Yes, thank you. Is that Brother Carly? Okay, the hand was up. Are there any observations that you might have on specifically Ezekiel chapter 5, verses 7 through 9? There was an interesting point made in especially verse 5 or 7 rather, that bore on the reason for this whole situation. What did Jehovah observe about that Jewish nation? The marshes?
Well, as we see, the nation was surrounded by these enemy nations who had detestable practices. But in Ezekiel 5, verse 7, Jehovah says they were more troublesome than the nations around them. So you would never expect that lone sheep to be a worse wolf than the wolves encircling it. But it was definitely a just pronouncement on Jehovah's part to bring about this to this nation.
Thank you for that, Brother Pullen.
That verse 7 goes on to say that you did not walk in my statutes or carry out my judicial decision, but instead you followed the judicial decisions of the nations all around you. So the fact that they stopped obeying Jehovah meant that they were going to lose his protection, and then they just deteriorated from there.
Thank you. And what observation did the paragraph make regarding the Babylonian presence during that period of time that highlights their reprehensible situation before Jehovah? According to paragraph 3, Sister Lomé.
It says it had been almost 10 years since their last invasion. So you would hope that they would have turned back to Jehovah at some point within that time, but instead they had become worse.
Thank you. Yeah. Arlise, please.
And Ezekiel 7:9 says he'll do to them like he's never done before. So here, allowing the Babylonians to basically crush Jerusalem into dust, invading the Holy Land, or invading the holy area of the high, the most holy, the temple. So, Jehovah basically allowed this prophecy to come true because they, knowing what was right, allowed themselves to do what was bad, which is worse than just doing bad.
Thank you. So true. The B question, what questions will we consider? Sister Johnston.
We're going to see what practical lessons we can learn from the interaction that Israel had with these nations. And also we're going to see that Ezekiel's prophecies do give us a hope, and what that hope will be.
Thank you. Sister Pullen.
And the theme for this lesson today is the nations will have to know that I'm Jehovah. So with great excitement, we look forward to finding out what that means for the nations, but also for us, how Jehovah can keep us safe.
Nice point. Thank you. So my mind went to paragraphs 11 and 12 of last week's lesson that showed that Ezekiel would at a point become mute, having nothing more to say to this condemned nation. Well, here we go. The last sentence. As the siege began, he turns his attention elsewhere to those nations. So he had nothing more to say to the nation of Israel. Let's begin then our historic overview of these nations and what the situation, the relationship they had with the nation of Israel under the subheading, Relatives Who Treated Israel with Utter Scorn, paragraphs 5 and 6.
Ammon, Moab, and Edom were, in a sense, blood relatives of Israel. Despite their family ties and shared history, those nations built up a long record of hostility towards God's people and treated them with utter scorn. Consider the Ammonites. They descended from Abraham's nephew Lot through his younger daughter. Their language was so closely related to Hebrew that God's people could likely understand it. Because of this family bond, Jehovah told the Israelites not to initiate war against Ammon. Yet, in the days of the judges, the Ammonites joined Moabite king Eglon in oppressing Israel. Later, when Saul was made king, the Ammonites attacked Israel. And in the days of King Jehoshaphat, they again joined forces with Moab to invade the Promised Land.
The question on 5 and 6, what was the relationship between the Ammonites and the Israelites. Brother Bland, please.
Well, Abraham's nephew Lot had two daughters, and the younger one was from whom the Ammonites descended. So they were closely related as fleshly relatives.
Yes, thank you. Brother Gregor.
And we see that this relationship is pretty well understood too by the several instances of oppression they face. Israel's and Jehovah had instructed them not to initiate war with the Ammonites, but it wasn't a reciprocated action. And specifically in 1 Samuel 11, 1-4, we see that the Ammonites demanded a surrender of the Israelites to Jabesh with a cruel and humiliating requirement that they each bore the right eye out. So as a whole, we see it wasn't the happiest of relationships between the two.
Thank you. Shows the inclination of that nation. Sister Johnston, please.
In those scriptures that are cited from Judges, we also see in what way the Ammonites treated the Israelites, in that for 18 years, they demanded a very burdensome tax, which which strengthened Moab, but it was draining Israel's resources. So we see how very unlovingly and viciously they treated their relatives.
Yeah, good point. So a constant state of hostilities existed between their blood relatives and the nation of Israel. But again, the question arises, were they completely innocent in this situation? Not necessarily. It's interesting if we happen to notice at the top of the chapter, the scripture that forms the theme for this. Who would like to read? Could we get a volunteer to read that theme scripture, Ezekiel 25, verse 17? Would someone like to read that for us, please? Sister Carly.
I will execute on them great acts of vengeance with furious punishments, and they will have to know that I am Jehovah when I bring my vengeance on them.
Yeah, so that, and who is he addressing here? Well, if we look at the context, he's addressing the Philistines, whom we'll talk about next week, and a group called the Kerethites. Now, the Kerethites were actually members of the Kerethite nation, were associated with Philistines, but members of that group were actual faithful servants of King David, even staying loyal to him during the rebellion of Absalom, who our video just prior to this spoke about. So there were faithful individuals among those groups, yet they were at constant enmity with Jehovah's people, and the relation and Israel's reaction with them, or relationship with them, proved to be troublesome, problematic for them. Well, let's go on to paragraph 7.
The Moabites too were descendants of Lot, but through his older daughter. Jehovah told the Israelites not to engage in war with Moab, but the Moabites did not return the kindness. Instead of helping their cousins who were escaping slavery in Egypt, they tried to prevent them from entering the promised land. Moabite king Balak hired Balaam to curse the Israelites, and Balaam taught Balak how to lure the Israelite men into committing immorality and idolatry. For centuries, the Moabites continued to oppress their relatives, right down to Ezekiel's day.
How did the Moabites treat their cousins, the descendants of Israel? Sister Watts.
Well, when the Israelites were trying to escape slavery in Egypt, their cousins, the Moabites, didn't even help them. In fact, they prevented them from entering the promised land. And that type of treatment, ill treatment, continued for centuries, right down to Ezekiel's time.
Thank you. What specific example was raised in the paragraph, Brother Briggs?
There's an example of Balak that hired Balaam to tempt or prevent the Israelites from coming into the promised land, trying to curse them. And of course, the Moabites were the ones that tempted the Israelites into adult immorality and worshiping their gods.
Thank you. Yeah, so quite a history. Brother Bland, please.
And because of their rebellion against Jehovah, engaging in sexual immorality with the Moabite women, there were about 24,000 Israelites who died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very, very true. So all of these accounts, we have a comment from Brother Watts, please.
Stood out to me that so far we've discussed the two, Ammonites and Moabites, and in both cases, Jehovah told the Israelites, leave them alone. But that was not enough for the Ammonites and the Moabites. They still opposed Israel, initiated war, tried to bring Jehovah's displeasure on them. And so it's easy to see why Jehovah turned his attention to them.
Thank you. Yeah, good observation. We appreciate that. So we see the contentious relationship that these neighboring nations had against their related nation of Israel. Now, next week, we'll discuss further nations and how they related to that situation. So let's now give our attention back to our chairman, Brother Watts.
Thank you very much, Brother Johnston, for leading the excellent discussion. Nice introduction to this subject where we're going to turn our attention to the nations that surrounded Israel and see what warnings Jehovah had for them. Well, our whole meeting was just full of warning examples. And like we said from the outset, Jehovah, he could have just put the principles and the laws in the Bible to tell us to stay away from these different qualities that are so dangerous. But having the example of individuals to really see it in action, what a benefit it was. For example, with Korah, maintaining that humble spirit we saw was so important, especially if we have additional privileges or in the congregation. Even if we've been in the truth for a long time, it helps us to be aware of that pride and overconfidence. So a humble spirit will help us. And then we saw with our videos, the example of Adam. Don't just accept invitations to do something. Consider the consequences. With Absalom, be content. Trust those that Jehovah is using. Solomon, avoid that trap of overconfidence and thinking that we can make our own decisions. Judas Iscariot, don't give in to even a little bit of greed because we can lose our contentment. And all the way through to our Bible study with Ammon and Moab, the way we treat each other, it matters to Jehovah. And we'll continue to see that with our Bible study in the coming weeks. These real people illustrate the danger of bad qualities. So we can be determined we're going to avoid those similar types of mistakes. Now, next week, if you ever feel anxious about how you're going to make ends meet, care for your material needs, there's a very nice part. We'll be encouraged by it. It's entitled, I Am Your Inheritance. We'll see how we can trust in Jehovah to help us to take care of our needs. We'll have a local needs part that we'll all benefit from. And then with our congregation Bible study, we're going to see how we can react to and deal with opposition, especially if it comes from those that we're close to, like unbelieving family members. Well, our final song is going to strengthen our courage. And so we look forward to singing that together. It's song number 126. Stay awake, stand firm, and grow mighty. Let's sing that together, and then we'll ask Brother Pullen to close our good meeting this week with a prayer. Song 126.